The alert did not come in the form of a military escalation, a declaration of intent, or a territorial breach. It came as a single pulse along the tri-spatial beacon at the Meridian Fold, encoded in an obsolete protocol, no longer in use by the Ya. Elder races, a signal that should have been impossible for a species less than 1,000 years into spaceflight to even recognize, much less utilize correctly. Archon Thane Virel Dizaro, presiding strategist of the Uvarn High Directive, and keeper of the intervening order, lowered his frilled mandibles slowly as the translated message shimmered on the vaulted command hall's resonance field. Human envoy requests parley under Section 9 of the Accord of Conscious Entities terms. Peace, knowledge exchange, and mutual observation. No weapons, no escorts. The chamber remained silent for 7 rotations of the time crystal. Not from indecision, but from disbelief that it was not simply the words that disturbed the tribunal, but the structure correct, ancient, and precise reserved for civilizations that had undergone the long trials of ascension, civilizations that had bled across epochs to earn the right to speak with parity. And yet here they were, humans, less than a galactic blink away from stone and steam, daring to speak the language of the old powers with unshaken poise. They've skipped the trial, muttered High Orator Kellis's Tron, her voice barely audible through her trifold breathing valves. They've cut across what took us millennia. Beside her, scholar mediator Yox Talzin, known for his reluctance to judge too quickly, a historian by calling and diplomat, by oath clicked his 2 foreclaws thoughtfully against his data veil. His features, sun-worn and carved with ritual etchings from 42 treaty cycles, betrayed no emotion, but the tone of his voice carried a trace of something rare among the Yavarn Unis. Or perhaps, he said, they have endured their own trial, one shorter in length, but not lesser in suffering, and chose, unlike others, to learn forward. Dizarol did not turn to face him. His gaze remained locked on the floating sigil of Earth's rotating sphere bright, chaotic, imbalanced in ecosystemic symmetry, and yet undeniably alive in a way the Dominion's worlds had long ceased to be. The Archon's voice, when it came, was measured and low, not as a warrior's command, but as a tactician's concession. They are not to be dismissed. Kellis's hissed her disapproval quietly, but said nothing more. They had watched Earth for centuries, monitored from a safe distance, charted their wars, documented their failures, catalogued their growth. The Uvarn had predicted self-destruction, or, at best, planetary stasis. No model had accounted for this coordinated diplomatic transmission across interstellar boundaries, invoking ancient law with surgical accuracy. No threats, no claims, just a request to talk. This, in itself, was unsettling. For species that had reached the stars through conquest, trade empires, or genetic manipulation, the notion of conversation preceding demonstration was alien in its own right. Yox Talzin took 1 step forward into the light of the query field. I volunteer to receive them. Kellis's turned sharply toward him. Why? She asked, not with scorn, with real confusion. The scholar blinked once. Because if they truly are what they appear to be, then the galaxy is no longer shaped by time, but by intention. And we must understand their intention before it is too late to match it. Dizarao remained still, but the flick of his eyes toward the Chancellor scribes signaled agreement. So it was decided. The humans would be received, not as children, not as invaders, but as something far more complicated, as a possibility. The Uvarn delegation vessel Shalinter, a diplomacy-engineered Leviathan, designed not for elegance, but for presence, breached the Meridian Fold's magnetic veil in solemn silence. Its arrival signaled only by the ceremonial triple tone, reserved for civil exchanges between equal states, in itself was unprecedented. For eons, the Meridian Fold had served as a natural boundary of influence. An invisible wall, neither formalized nor written, but understood by all emerging civilizations as the line not to cross without invitation. To the Yavarn, the fold was not merely a spatial landmark. It was a philosophical doctrine, a symbol of earned presence in the galactic arena. And yet humanity had crossed it calmly, without escort, without apology. Within, the primary audience chamber of Shalinter, a vault of black-vaulted hexaglass, and low-gravity acoustics designed to suppress emotional overtones. Scholar Yox Talzin stood flanked by 6 protocol custodians, each bearing a sigil of negotiation rank and bloodline memory. His robes bore only the mark of the unbiased eye. Across from him, the human envoy stepped forward as the light adjusted to their biology. She was smaller than the Yavarn imagined, soft-featured, but composed. Her presence carried no aggression, but neither did it carry submission. Ambassador Lara Halim, Earth Delegation. Here under terms declared in the Tricycle Peace Index, Section 9, Clause 1. First contact through diplomacy. A pleasure, Scholar Talzin. Her voice was neither strained nor practiced. It was level, precise, trained in the art of phrasing. Without concealment. Yox Talzin responded with the lowest of the 7 respectful nods in Yavarn protocol. Not the bow reserved for allies, nor the tilt for inferiors. This was the equal mark. Your knowledge of ancient legal structure is ... thorough. Ambassador Halim allowed herself a faint smile, nothing more than a curve of intention. We study patterns before we draw conclusions, especially when the canvas is older than we are. Talzin narrowed his gaze, not in aggression, but in evaluation. You crossed the fold without request, without notice. Because requesting permission presumes we knew whom to ask. And we have learned that power often avoids naming itself until forced to. So instead of seeking consent, we sought conversation. The response was unorthodox. It was also correct. For a moment, the chamber held the silence that often preceded incursion debates. The silence of evaluation, of possible recalibration. Then, Talzin stepped forward just once. What is it you seek? Halim's eyes did not wander. Her voice did not rise. Not territory, not trade, not security guarantees. We seek understanding. We are aware of our speed, our ... unusual trajectory. And we are aware of the threat that speed can imply to systems built slowly. We are not here to challenge. We are here to clarify. Yox. Talzin looked down, just briefly, at the memory slab affixed to his wristband, a record of failed negotiations from 27 species over his 6 centuries of service. None had ever begun with this much restraint. No lists of demands, no declarations of right, no appeals to suffering, just clarity, just a request to be seen as something that might not fit the mold, but still belonged on the shelf. Talzin raised his head slowly. And let us begin with truth. Agreed. And with that word, one syllable, shared without defense, the meridian fold became something it had never been before. Permeable 3 rotations after the meridian exchange, the Yavarn High Directive convened in the deep deliberation hall beneath. The crystalline underlayers of Varnus Prime. It was a space untouched by sunlight for millennia. Not out of secrecy, but out of reverence only used when precedent was being rewritten. The issue on the table was simple in phrasing, impossible in implication. How had humanity advanced without asking permission? Hierarcher Kellis's Tron opened the session with a precision query, as was custom. What systems of acceleration allowed them to breach pre-ascension thresholds without institutional collapse? In Yavarn policy, such questions were rhetorical probes, not accusations, yet the room did not respond in kind. Instead, scholar-mediator Yox Talzin activated a projected timeline that spanned a single human century only, 100 revolutions of their homeworld, around their sun. What filled that space was not linear growth, It was exponential fracture. The first warp point field, the collapse of post-national structures, the unification under adaptive charters, 3 extinction level near misses, 4 continental upheavals, and stabilization, then propulsion, and emergence. He let the timeline play in silence before he spoke. They did not ascend because it was comfortable. They ascended because failure became unacceptable. Archon Thane Dizaral stared at the projection, his segmented fingers steepled, unmoving, and yet they remained fractured. He said flatly. Talzin inclined his head. Yes, but they manage. The fracture instead of hiding it. Their strength is not unity. It is plurality with direction. An engine built from disagreement that refuses to break. And the treaties? Kellis's pressed dot that perhaps was the greater anomaly dot in the last 20 solar years. Humanity had signed cooperative compacts with 5 species considered volatile or developmentally incompatible by Yvarn assessment. Standards. No coercion had been recorded. No resource leverage. Just terms. Transparent, even idealistic. Talzin summoned the Treaty of Thrsari onto the display. This was signed with a species that had never before honored a pact beyond 6 cycles. They agreed to Earth's charter terms without modification. The humans required one clause only: abolition of child-bonded labor in exchange for atmospheric medicine. He paused there long enough for the weight to settle. No tariffs, no territory claims, just one moral exchange. The silence was no longer evaluative. It was respectful, and a little uneasy. Dizaral finally exhaled, a long hiss echoing down. His second throat. We assumed they would hunger for dominion, that they would mirror our first centuries of expansion, that they would mistake velocity for control. Talzin turned to face him fully. They do not mirror us. That is precisely why we are unprepared for them. Kellis's, ever the realist, folded her forelimbs. Do they understand what their presence threatens? Talzin answered carefully. I believe they do. And I believe they approach with diplomacy, not because they must, but because they have. Decided they should? Not survival instinct? She asked. Something rarer, he replied. Ethical self-interest. The decision to be careful with power before it's required. For the Yvarn, who had learned caution only after catastrophe, it was an unfamiliar concept, but the pattern was there, undeniable, unfolding in real time and drawing new shapes. On an ancient Mapculus leaned back, her voice unusually quiet. Then what do we do now? Talzin offered no direct answer, only a phrase that had not been spoken since the Yvarn first began recording history. We listen. The Emberline. Ring had not been occupied since the fall of the Aurak Imperials, an extinct civilization so old their language was now classified as speculative myth. Suspended above the gravity well of the Black Star Vernaxis, the station remained structurally intact only because its builders had laced every joint with quantum resonance seals that refused entropy. It was a fitting place for something new too. Begin. Or something old to be challenged. The humans chose it. The Yvarn agreed. It was neutral, it was ancient, it was honest, on the 4th cycle of the convergence. Both delegations docked without armed escort. No automated turrets were reactivated. No bodyguards exchanged posture signals. There was only the meeting chamber wide, circular, and open to the curve of stars, visible through a transparent ceiling, older than every Earth civilization combined. Ambassador. Lara Halim entered first, not out of pride, out of punctuality. Behind her walked a linguist, a biosocial engineer, and a cultural historian, all civilian experts, none bearing rank. Her clothing was practical. Her data sleeve bore no crest. Only the image of Earth's moon etched in white dot scholar Yox Talzin met her in the center of the chamber. He arrived alone. Formality was not dispensed with. It was simply ... reframed. Ambassador, he said, offering a gesture of respectful. Triangulation with his hands. Scholar. Thank you for accepting our presence on territory, once guarded by silence. Talzin observed her carefully. There was no arrogance in her tone, no hesitation in her gait. She was not here to impress. She was here to proceed. Yavarn Scholar gestured toward the interface dais, where two hollow fields flickered to life. Side by side, one displaying the known laws of the consensus, the other an untranslated scroll of Earth's Declaration of Post-Terrestrial Ethics. Your opening position, he said, mentions cooperation without precedent. But cooperation requires scaffolding, shared assumptions, legal symmetry. Halim nodded once. We come not with matching shapes, but with adaptable principles. We do not claim equality by history. We offer it through restraint. Talzin narrowed his gaze. Elaborate. We possess weapons capable of planetary destabilization. We have not used them. We have artificial general intelligence capable of manipulation. We restrict its autonomy. We have colonies with excess resource potential. We do not exploit without consent. That is our symmetry. He blinked slowly, one membrane after the other. It was not posturing. It was a recalibration. You are saying, your greatest diplomatic offering is what you have chosen not to do? Yes? It hung in the air, heavy not as a threat, but as a moral reckoning. The why. Varn had always assumed that restraint came after regulation. They had never considered that it could emerge from self-imposed boundaries. Halim's voice remained steady. We are not here because we grew faster. We are here because, while growing faster, we remembered that force is not legacy. Memory is. Talzin took a long moment to process the implications. It was not the pace of human advancement that now unsettled him. It was its trajectory. Charted not by hunger, but by design. He moved to the central negotiation field and placed his seal upon it, a symbol of formal recognition. Then let this be the first session of shared intent. Halim did not smile. She only replied, agreed. And far above them, the stars observed what neither delegation fully understood, yet that the shape of the galaxy had already begun to change. Not with fire, not with conquest, but with a single, calm conversation in a room filled with memory. Had begun as a cautious alignment of vocabulary and frameworks, was now something deeper. Less about definitions, more about intent. And yet, it was during this session, amidst a review of Earth's technological ascent, that the room first became quiet, not out of strategy, but out of grief. Scholar Yox Talzin stood before the rotating projection of Earth's century-spanning development spiral. The visual had been requested not by the Yavarn, but by Halim herself, an open disclosure of what had occurred between Earth's ignition of orbital reach and the moment its first Alcubierre module pierced the fold. What the Yavarn had expected was a sequence of innovations. What they received was a ledger of cost. There were no interruptions as the images moved. Famine across 4 continents, atmospheric collapse in 2 biospheres, wars over desalinated water, refugees orbiting stateless, a virus that nearly emptied cities, a missile crisis diffused by a machine learning algorithm that refused to obey, and then quiet, and then Resolve Alim stood in silence as her planet's scars unfolded in the air between them. She offered no commentary, only data. When the last sequence faded, no one spoke immediately. The chamber, designed to carry voices across the void, held its silence with reverence. Talzin stepped forward, his voice soft, devoid of the usual procedural tone. You do not hide your collapses. We learned that hiding the wound is what lets it infect everything else. He nodded slowly. And this acceleration, it began not from discovery, but from necessity. Halim's eyes remained fixed on the space where the projection had vanished. We had no elder to guide us, no dominion to correct us. We reached the precipice alone, and once we saw how far we'd fallen, we realized survival was no longer enough. We had to change the nature of our climb. Talzin looked down at the edge of the negotiation table, where the auric glyphs for legacy and suffering had once shared the same root character. You chose evolution. Under duress, we chose restraint. Under threat of extinction. He studied her then, not as a diplomat, not as a representative of an anomaly asterisk, but as a survivor. And in that moment, something ancient in Yuvarn thinking began to fracture. Foundational belief that only time could birth wisdom, that only scale could create control. Most civilizations do not survive that much chaos intact. We didn't, Halem said softly. Parts of us died. What you see now, our diplomacy, our structure, our pace, it's not tradition. It's what we rebuilt out of the rubble. A second version of ourselves, made not for conquest, but for endurance. Talzin stepped away from the table and bowed not a protocol nod, but the deep inclination of spine reserved for sorrow shared. The others in the chamber followed. One by one, even Cullises, who until now had spoken only in skepticism, this was no longer first contact, it was first comprehension, and above the Emberline ring, where stars burned cold and distant, the archive beacons recorded the first entry in a new chapter of galactic relations. Not how fast humans had risen, but what they had endured to rise at all. There comes a moment in every great dominion when the assumptions that gird its stability begin to weaken, not by confrontation, not by failure, but by observation of something that should not be, and yet is. This was that moment for the Yuvarn, following the sessions. On Earth's developmental trauma, the High Directive convened again, this time in the Hall of Continuity, a sanctum designed not for debate, but for reflection. Its walls shimmered with the encoded histories of over 90 sapient species brought into the Yuvarn Dominion, some through absorption, some through war, most through patient mentorship over centuries. But there were no human glyphs on these walls. Not yet, not because humanity had been forgotten, but because it had not been expected Archon Thane Dizaro paced along the edge of the memory chamber, the sound of his steps echoing in a rhythm older than his lineage. He was not a sentimental leader. He had overseen the stabilization of 4 rogue systems. He had collapsed insurrections without a single discharge of particle weaponry. His mind was built for systems. And yet no system could explain Fizza species that had climbed from digital infancy to interstellar diplomacy in less time than it took the UI Varn to conduct a single full census, a species that had neither genetic optimization nor deep ancestral memory, a species whose institutions collapsed and reformed within a generation, yet somehow maintained continuity of principle. A word of Cullises stood beside him, her voice sharper than usual. They lack ancestral bonding. They have no memory chambers. Their biological time is barely long enough for 3 succession cycles. And yet, they remember things not because they are instructed to, but because they refuse to forget. These are all paused, hands behind his back, eyes locked on a projection of Earth's early orbital architecture. Have we mistaken time for virtue? Yox Talzin entered quietly behind them, not interrupting, only listening. At first, his presence in the Hall of Continuity was not common. He preferred the precision of dialogue to the weight of symbolism. But he spoke now. We thought speed led to instability, that the faster a mind races, the sooner it collapses under its own momentum. He moved closer to the center of the chamber, where Auroch inscriptions marked the first doctrines of contact. But humanity did not race to power. They raced away from collapse, not to dominate, but to survive themselves. Cullises turned, doubt still thick in her posture. And yet, we do not know if they can endure success. Crisis shape them? Will comfort undo them? Talzin did not answer immediately. He drew forth the record slab from the previous session, The treaty signed between Earth and the Vexery swarm, a species once believed incapable of negotiation due to biochemical aggression cycles. He held it up for them both. They turned the Vexery, without force, without cybernetic override. They simply listened, found what hurt, and gave it a name. Kellis has studied the slab. No species has done that before, not with the swarm. Talzin offered a rare, solemn nod. No species. But a people did. There it was, the distinction for all the genetic precision. The Yaivarn had become a civilization of systems, not of selves humanity. In its recklessness, in its fragility, had become a civilization of wills and will. When focused, becomes more. Then instinct, it becomes a choice Zarl, turned from the wall at last. Then the question is not whether they are like us. It is whether we still remember how to be like them. The silence that followed was not discomfort. It was respect, and perhaps, for the first time in millennia, a quiet stirring of envy, because across that vast darkness, a younger race had looked into the abyss that most civilizations spent eons avoiding, and instead of flinching, they had studied it, given it language, and kept walking. Final session of the Emberline Convergence did not begin with fanfare, nor with formal declarations. It began, as most meaningful things do, with a question not asked aloud, but implied by presence. The human delegation arrived first, as they had at every meeting, bearing no guards, no fleet signature, no insignias of supremacy, only a worn diplomatic case carried by Ambassador Halim, its contents known to none outside her inner circle. The Yavarn delegation arrived shortly after, this time with no hierarchs, no observers, no ceremonial drone recorders, only Talzin, alone. An act that said, "This is no longer performance. This is truth." They met in the central hall of the He Orak station, whose walls were now dimly pulsing not with light, but with residual activation, as if the station itself, long dormant, had decided it was time to listen again. Talzin placed his data slab on the negotiation dais and let it sync with the Orak matrix. He said nothing. Halim placed hers beside it and waited the Orak interface respond and overlaying the two inputs into a unified pattern, adjusting glyph by glyph, line by line, until what remained was neither human nor Yaivarn in structure. It was fractal, self-similar, modular, recursive, a treaty not based on parity, but adaptability, not a merger, not a surrender, but a network of terms designed to bend, respond, evolve. Talzin studied the final form and exhaled slowly through his secondary spiracles. This is not a Dominion charter. No, Helen replied. It's an ecosystem. He ran his hand over the primary clause cluster. No claims to territory, no assertions of temporal priority, no demand for technological sharing. The treaty didn't command it, invite it. It didn't list punishments, it framed thresholds. Most striking of all, it didn't require formal allegiance. Instead, it proposed contextual trust to be renegotiated at intervals aligned with both parties' ethical frameworks. This is an unstable document, he said, though there was no accusation in it. It's alive, she answered. We wanted something that grows with the relationship, not outlives it. Talzin closed his eyes briefly. He had read tens of thousands of treaties, enforced hundreds, but never signed one that admitted its own fallibility from the outset. Do you understand what this changes? Halim nodded just once. We're not here to change your structure. We're here to offer a second one beside it, not an empire. A parallel. A beat of silence, then another, and finally, Talzin placed the seal and imprint of his personal credibility, one that could not be revoked, without dissolving his entire standing in the High Directive. The Orak station absorbed it, then pulsed. Once gently, Halim followed, pressing her hand to the slab. The treaty recorded her biometric data. Earth seal appeared simple, understated. A spiral, coiled inward like a question still being asked. No applause followed, no music played, just the sound of a document completing its integration across two civilization stalls looked at her, not as an official, not even as a scholar, but as a being recognizing another ambassador. What do you call this compact in your tongue? She didn't hesitate. The fractal treaty. Why? Because every time you look closer at it, it still makes sense. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, for the first time in recorded galactic history, a representative of the Yavarn and a delegate of a newly risen species left the chamber as co-authors of a living accord knot, a pact of necessity, but one of possibility. It did not take long for the fractal treaty to ripple outward. Like gravity bending around a new mass, the political architecture of the Glisten corridor shifted, not violently, but perceptibly. Protocol channels filled with inquiries from observer civilizations, some skeptical, some intrigued, none indifferent. But in the third assembly of the Triune, conclave, a body comprising the oldest non-aligned powers descent, rose swiftly. The Threxery core worlds came the first formal objection. Their envoy, Ministerkin Roland VX, addressed the conclave with the characteristic bluntness of a species whose culture revered kinetic truth over rhetorical subtlety. You yield to fireflies, he said. They burn hot and fast, and then they vanish. What they call restraint is only fear of their own destruction. And what you call diplomacy is just delay in conquest. No one interrupted. It was not protocol. It was provocation, and it worked. Several envoys stirred, some nodding, others unreadable. The Ivarn, in ages past, might have responded with silence or withdrawal. But that day they sent Yox Talzin. He did not rise with flourish. He did not counter with anger. He walked to the speaker's dais slowly, steadily, as though the moment needed to arrive at him. He stood without notes, and then he spoke. We did not yield. We listened. Asterisk, his voice was deliberate, low, resonant, and what we heard was not hunger, not deception. What we heard was a species that had no right to survive, and did anyway, not by strength, but by remembering itself better than it had been taught to forget. He stepped forward slightly, scanning the hall. They are not fireflies. They are torches built from debris. Each part of them bears the burn mark of catastrophe, but they have learned to burn without consuming. A murmur moved through the chamber, subtle but spreading. They did not offer us allegiance. They offered us caution. They asked to stand beside, not above, not below. And when a species asks not for dominion, but for dialogue, we do not meet that with contempt. We meet it with curiosity. Vhex's mandibles flared in disapproval. You mistake adaptability for virtue. Talzin's reply came without hesitation. No. We recognize adaptability guided by principle. The humans did not bargain from weakness. They bargained from conviction. They offered nothing they would not accept in return. They demanded nothing they could not justify to themselves. He looked across the chamber, then upward, to the observatory ring where archivists recorded the session for public relay. And perhaps that is what disturbs us, not that they rose fast, but that they rose measured when all logic said they should fall. He placed both hands on the railing, so judge them if you must, but understand that in doing so, you judge not their speed nor their style, but the uncomfortable possibility that wisdom need not wait for age. He stepped back, he bowed once and said no more. The chamber held its silence, longer than custom permitted, but no one spoke to break it, because it was not just the humans who had challenged galactic precedent. It was now the Yavarn who had defied. It too not by claiming supremacy, but by choosing to believe that some truths, when spoken softly enough, do not need to echo to be heard. Far from Emberline, far from the conclave halls and the relay beacons broadcasting treaty implications across the trade routes of the Glisten Reach, The world of Yavin Prime sat in quiet orbit beneath its twin suns, unchanged, untouched, dignified in its inertia, that it was here that Archon Thane Virel Dizarl stood, alone in the chamber of still thrones, surrounded by the statues of his predecessors, silent titans of diplomacy, whose sculpted visages bore expressions not of triumph, but of caution. The room had no sound amplification, no data feeds, no illumination. Beyond natural resonance from the polar auroras pulsing outside, it was designed this way, to remind the sitting Archon of what power becomes when time wears away the noise. Zaral had not spoken since his return from the Emberline Convergence. Not in council, not in record. He had watched the broadcasts, read the interpretations, listened to the ripple of planetary academies now using human case studies to re-examine their own developmental models. But only now did he confront the question. Without translation, without committee, without Talzine's careful nuance or Kellis's precision critiques, what, exactly, had they witnessed? He moved slowly across the chamber, his hand brushing the carved names of the original triumvirate, the ones who had unified the scattered Yovarn systems into coherence, using law, language, and lineage. They had done so over centuries. Earth had done it in decades, and with disagreement instead of unification, with contradiction instead of conformity, with choice instead of inheritance. Human rise did not mimic the Yavin model. It defied it, and yet it had produced something enduring. He stopped before the central statue, that of Archon Thane Ural Hess, whose diplomatic principles had founded the directive's foundational treaty structure nearly 6,000 solar cycles prior. Etched beneath it was the dictum he had spoken before signing the Accord of 9 Worlds. That which is earned slowly is held dearly. Dizarl stared at the words for a long time, and then, without speaking, without sighing, he raised a hand and traced a new line beneath them. Just once, with his clawed fingertip, not to erase, but to add. The line would not glow. It would not transmit. It would not even last more than a few cycles before being polished away by environmental resonance. But it said something, without saying anything at all, and that which is earned under threat of extinction is held with both hands. He turned then, not as a leader burdened by decision, but as a witness humbled by perspective. He did not summon the council. He did not issue a doctrine. He simply walked away from the Chamber of Thrones for the first time in his tenure, knowing that the future of his people might not be something they authored alone, and perhaps, for the first time since the first star paths were drawn, that was not something to fear it, was something to understand it, would be some time. Before the Fractal Treaty bore the weight of history, treaties rarely announce their own consequences. They linger. They mature. And then, quietly, they redefine the boundaries they were never meant to touch. But on the 100th rotation since its signing, the treaty was entered into the Galactic Archive of Futures, a non-partisan chronicle maintained by the archivists of Rees is a species so old, so methodical, they recorded not events, but inflection points. Moments where a timeline tilted, however subtly, toward a shape not previously calculable. The entry was not ornate. No title etched in gold. No dramatic exclamation. Just a single descriptor in ancient Auric. Cooperation without coercion. Below that line, the details unfolded. That the Yvarn Dominion, for the first time in recorded diplomacy, entered an agreement not based on mentorship, enforcement, or asymmetry, but on reciprocity. That the species named Homo sapiens, origin, Sol 3, self-identified as humans, achieved parity through dialogue before demonstrating supremacy through power. That the treaty included no guaranteed permanence, only shared intent to adapt across time. And lastly, that this event marked the beginning of a conceptual shift in galactic politics from legacy-based governance to value-based alignment. The archivists appended a rare notation, projected ideological resonance. High, meanwhile, back in the Emberline sector, the Oryx station, long dormant, long empty, remained quietly active. It had received more than a dozen inquiries from species previously isolated, now curious. Some sent observers, some sent questions, and some, without prompting, sent recordings of their own collapses. As if humanity's openness had given others permission to be honest. 2. Ambassador Lyra Halim, long retired from active service, sat on Earth's moon base in a quiet observatory where she occasionally lectured to students not yet born when she'd walked into that auric chamber. On her final day before stepping down from public life, she was asked by a young scholar, "Did they listen to us? With all their history, with all their caution, why didn't they dismiss us as reckless?" She had smiled gently, not with pride, but with understanding. "Because we didn't ask them to listen to our victories." She turned her gaze upward, to the same stars she'd stood beneath decades earlier. "We asked them to listen to our mistakes." In the end, it wasn't Earth's power that had bent the arc of interstellar diplomacy. It was Earth's willingness to admit its fragility, its choice to carry wisdom not in pride, but in patience, and its refusal to wait for permission to become. Something better, that too, was recorded in the archive, not as doctrine, but as a question. What else might emerge if others chose the same path?